Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, When Cyberbullying Spills into Schools. My name is Michelle Davis, and I'm a senior writer at Education Week Digital Directions. I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar. Our sponsor is Talk About It Anonymous Communication Service. Bullying in schools has been an issue that educators have grappled with forever. But as many students move toward a social life that includes a significant online component, cyberbullying is becoming an increasing concern. There's been a lot of media attention paid to high-profile cyberbullying cases in which students who felt victimized committed suicide. But there's been less emphasis on helping school leaders figure out how best to deal with this issue. Because cyberbullying often occurs outside of school, the parameters around how and when principals and administrators should intervene remain murky, even though the impact of cyberbullying is often felt within school hallways and classrooms. Lacking clear-cut guidelines on how to handle cyberbullying that spills over into schools, administrators are struggling to develop their own policies and methods of dealing with such behavior. Should they monitor sites like Facebook to police student behavior? Can they legally take disciplinary action against students for online cyberbullying outside of school? And how can school leaders create a school culture where bullying is unacceptable among students both in school and online? Today we have two nationally recognized experts on cyberbullying who will help educators develop strategies for combating bullying both in schools and online, and who can clarify the sometimes confusing legalities around how and when school leaders can act. First, we'll hear from Nancy Willard, who's an attorney and the executive director of the Center for Safe and Responsible Internet Use, and who has developed guidelines and strategies to help educators deal with everything from cyberbullying and sexting. And we'll hear from Barbara Jane Paris, the principal of Canyon Vista Middle School in Austin, Texas, who's also the legislative liaison for bullypolice.org. Barbara Jane frequently testifies on a state and national level about how to prevent and deal with cyberbullying in schools, and she'll talk about her own experiences as a school leader. Before we begin, now is a good time to review some of the technical aspects of today's presentation. We want this to be an interactive experience, so send in your questions. Please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're having any other difficulties, try clicking the Help button for support. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Nancy for an introduction to this topic. Nancy?
Thank you very much. It's really great to be with you here virtually. I am in Philadelphia right now, and I just completed a 3-hour workshop this morning for the National Association of School Psychologists. So I'm going to attempt to deliver a 15-minute version of this 3-hour workshop, and we'll see how we go here. The introductory thoughts that I have on this issue are several. First of all, why is this important? We know that the digital aggression, including the aggression that's occurring outside of school, is leading to violence at school. It's sometimes causing students who don't feel safe to come to school, and it can be interfering with the ability of our kids to learn. So we have to make sure that schools have the legal authority to respond, but we also have to pay attention to how they are responding and make sure that their response is effective. The second major issue that we have to pay attention to is the fact that adults are generally not in a position where they're able to supervise these interactions between students. And also, students are often not reporting these incidents to adults. The other thing we need to recognize is that the vast majority of students don't like to see people engaged in hurtful behavior. And these hurtful communications are visible to them. So it's really important that we implement peer-based prevention and intervention systems, and also that we consider the use of digital reporting systems so that students might feel more comfortable reporting when something is going on. These harmful incidents, the research is showing, is sometimes are a continuation of hurtful face-to-face interactions that are going on in school. Other times, they're in retaliation for these kinds of hurtful actions. sometimes they're mutual conflict, and other times the person who appears to be being hurtful online is actually not the person who's engaged in the hurtful behavior. That is, we've got some impersonation going on. We also have to recognize that sometimes students are targeting school staff, and there's some different legal standards involved that I will be getting to. We have to recognize that students who do not target school staff are those who are happy and successful, feel respected, and feel like they're learning. So if something has happened, so a student is targeting a school staff, that's a red flag that something is wrong. All of these factors mean that we have to make sure that we're engaging in a complete and objective investigation, looking at the actions of all of the parties, not just the student who has posted hurtful material online. Increasing research is demonstrating that the school responses to bullying often are not effective. The Youth Voice Project found that only 42% of students who are bullied at school report those bullying incidents to the school, and only 34% of the time after such report did things get better. Now, what grade would we give students if they got things right 34% of the time? There's also the increased risk of anonymous digital retaliation in response to punishment. So it's really important that we shift our focus from ineffective punitive responses to more restorative interventions that will address the harm and keep all of the students successfully engaged in school. So the issues we need to address are what are the cyber-savvy objectives, the legal issues, comprehensive approach, effective investigations, and restorative interventions. I have a new book out. It's called Cyber Savvy, Embracing Digital Safety and Civility, and there are 4 components to being cyber savvy. 1 is that young people keep themselves safe. 2 is that they present a positive image of themselves online. 3 is that they respect others, respect the rights, privacy, property of others. And 4 is that they take responsibility for the well-being of others. We really need to increase the focus on helpful allies, effective bystanders. So let's get right into the legal issues. First question is, when does a school official have the authority to respond to students' off-campus speech? There's actually been a very consistent holding in the federal courts that school officials have the authority to respond if students' off-campus speech has, or there are really good reasons to believe it could, cause a substantial disruption at school or interference with the rights of other students to be secure. In other words, what we're doing is balancing students' free speech rights against the other very important rights of students to be safe and receive an education. If you think that you're going to respond to a student to assert your authority as a school official, you're going to get into legal trouble. Or if you think that the speech is offensive and contrary to the education mission, that's not your job if they're off campus. But you do have the authority to respond to protect the rights of other students. Substantial disruption could include the threat of violence, significant overall interference with the delivery of instruction, or a hostile environment that's been created for a particular student. And that you need to assess, saying, this student feels unsafe and unable to learn, and a third party would also agree with that. It's exceptionally important that students have notice that you intend and will respond to off-campus speech. That means you need to have language, at the very least, in your district policy. Even if it isn't in the state statute, include that. And I actually have a short article coming out in the School Administrator on that issue also. If you add this language, you need to understand this doesn't mean this is creating an affirmative obligation for school officials to monitor off-campus speech. It's not interfering with students' free speech rights unless that student is interfering with some other student's important rights. You're also not interfering with parents' rights because you're not trying to impose values. You're just trying to protect the rights of other students. What's the district's responsibility to respond? Well, this off-campus speech in combination with altercations that occur on campus could actually create a hostile environment. But I do believe, now there is no case law in this area, I do believe that schools would only be held liable if they have actual knowledge that this is occurring and then say, off campus, not my job, I'm not going to do a thing, even though there's clear evidence of a hostile environment at school. This doesn't mean that school officials have an obligation to monitor students when they're off campus. First of all, it's not possible. Secondly, that would violate student privacy. And third, it's not your job. Your job is to pay attention to kids at school. When can students' digital records be searched? A lot of questions in this area. We've got students' use of digital internet, which is largely not public, no expectation of privacy. But their personal digital device, significant expectation of privacy. What if that digital device, that personal one, is being used for instruction? Unfortunately, and then the next question is, who's searching? If you've got a situation where a student is a focal suspect to a crime, then that really means that you're involving law enforcement, and the search standard should be probable cause. When does the standard shift? Can the student refuse consent? Should the student be advised? If used instructionally, how are you going to deal with this? Unfortunately, I can't give you clear answers on this. These are questions that you need to take up with your local school council and also work out with your relationships with local law enforcement. Can students or staff sue other students and their parents? Yes, they can. There are 4 potential civil law remedies: defamation, invasion of privacy, false light, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Sometimes these actions are criminal. This includes threats, extortion, cyber harassment, cyber stalking, hate crimes, child pornography, sexual exploitation, and invasion of privacy. So for a comprehensive approach, what we have to do is ensure multidisciplinary collaboration. We've got to get education technology staff working as part of the safe school community to be addressing these digital issues. It's really important to build on a social emotional intelligence program, engage in effective needs assessment, and evaluate the effectiveness of your activities. There's a whole bunch of different policies that need to be reviewed. You're filtering to make sure principals can access material on any site, adding off-campus speech, cyber threat protocol, sexting, cell phones, extracurricular activities, and reporting. Schools should provide outreach, including professional development for staff, parent outreach, and community outreach. And provide students education. That's what my book focuses on. We need to focus on effective risk prevention education that reinforces positive norms, helps transmit and strengthen effective skills, including conflict resolution, and encourages young people to be helpful allies. We have to infuse the role of students into the risk prevention triangle. Now, starting from the bottom, we're transmitting positive social norms and effective skills to all students. Secondary, we're providing the skills and encouraging young people to help others. They report these incidents to others. The others need to know how to help them. And third, the students need to know when it's really serious and they ought to report to adults. Effective investigation. Couple of steps, and I'm working on a full guide for doing this, so it should be available in a couple of months. Need to preserve the digital evidence. Absolutely ascertain and determine the identities. It could be an impersonation situation. You can ask lesser involved students who might be involved. And then after you've saved everything, file an abuse report to get the material taken down. Next, it's really important to really carefully review the situation. Ask who's engaged in aggression, against whom, and why. Is this a continuation? Is this retaliation? Is this mutual conflict? What's happening in school? And especially if a staff member is targeted, what's going on with respect to the relationship between that student and the staff member? And is there any evidence of the potential for violence or self-harm? Lastly, we need to focus on restorative interventions. on? I'm waiting for my next slide to come up.
Well, why don't you keep on going and we'll catch up.
Okay. We'll catch up. Punitive basis. I'm not seeing it yet, but okay.
I've got it on my screen, so keep on going.
Okay. The approaches that are used in many schools are punishment-based. It's who violated the rule, and who can we punish in this situation. And I believe it's those kinds of situations that kind of a response is what is making it ineffective. That's why students think that school officials are not effective. So next slide. My system is down, so I'm going to say next slide for these. Right. Restorative approaches address the needs of the target, the aggressor, and the community, because these are community-based focuses. Restorative approaches give the targets a voice to be able to say, I was hurt. This is how this hurt me. That holds aggressors accountable. Not just through punishment, but holding them accountable, providing the opportunity for amends, encouraging reconciliation, and restoring the relationship so all of the students involved can continue to be successful in school. So we ask these questions. What is the harm to each person and to the community? What needs to be done to repair that harm? Who's responsible for the repair? And what needs to occur to prevent similar harm in the future? From the perspective of the aggressor, what we want is to ensure that that young person acknowledges that their actions have caused harm and to really understand the harmful impact experienced by the other. That is, we want to generate affective empathy so that they understand the hurt that was caused. We hope that they will then assume personal responsibility for their behavior and, as a consequence, take the steps to make amends and repair the harm. And additionally, to enunciate the intention that this will not occur again. Now, there are very formal processes that are sometimes recommended in what's called restorative interventions or restorative justice. Those processes are not generally needed for the vast majority of situations. They may be needed in situations that are more serious, that involve staff, or if there's a really recalcitrant aggressor. What I'm working on and researching are less formal processes so that we can really work to bring students together in this manner. It's also very important that if you have distressed students that you put a plan of action together to make sure that you're providing emotional support to them. Where are their sources of strength, family, friends, others, and how can they tap into those sources of strength? It's exceptionally important that schools start to evaluate the effectiveness of their response to these situations, both face-to-face bullying as well as online bullying. We need to be measuring effectiveness in this area. So this is my website. If I've gone through this too fast and they're now saying, wow, she's actually gotten through this in the time she said she would, there is a very long handout for my 3-hour workshop on my website that you can tie in. And just in case I went a little bit too fast, I have a new book out entitled Cyber Savvy, Embracing Digital Safety and Civility, and I've got 2 online courses, one of which is specifically on cyberbullying, the other on teaching internet safety, offered through knowledge delivery systems. And we are also starting a webinar series that really specifically focuses on digital use kinds of issues. What I'm working on right now are 3 projects. One of them is an online survey for schools to use to assess the norms, practices, and incidents that are within their school that are then used for needs assessment, instruction, and evaluation. A program to really foster helpful allies that is called Be a Friend, Lend a Hand. And as I mentioned before, I'm working on some guidelines for school leaders to be able to do, and templates to guide you in doing an effective investigation, restorative interventions, and evaluation of effectiveness. And thank you all for having me.
Well, Nancy, those slides were great, and I'm really glad you got through the entire presentation. A lot of people are posting comments that the slides have been really valuable, and they want to make sure they have access to them. So I want to remind everybody that an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available in the next 24 hours, and the PowerPoint slides will be available there, too, and that's all accessible through edweek.org. So thank you, Nancy. Great. Now we'd like to just take a moment and hear from our sponsor, Talk About It Anonymous Communication Service.
Thank you. We're really proud to be able to sponsor this event in which luminaries such as Ms. Willard and Barbara Paris are discussing such an important topic. Talk About It really is the first and only service of its kind. It allows students to speak up anonymously if they so choose, through text and online messaging, and all of this communication is logged in secure. The results, particularly when it comes to reducing bullying and cyberbullying, have been incredible. So please stick around. Later in the session, we'll be sharing findings from hundreds of thousands of messages that students have submitted through our online service. We'll also provide a link to our new paper, Creating a Culture of Dialogue, which provides practical steps for creating an environment in which our students will feel comfortable speaking up. So thanks so much, and please stick around.
Great. Thank you. Now I want to welcome Barbara Jane Paris, the principal of Canyon Vista Middle School in Austin, Texas. Barbara?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to speak this afternoon from the perspective that I think there's a lot of people share my role in life. They're probably sitting in a room right now with a sticky note on their door because there are 1,300 staff and students out wandering around, and your sticky note says, I'm on a webinar, please do not disturb me, and people will knock on your door anyway and say, this will only take a second. So I can completely identify with many of the people listening. So I'm going to make it purposeful and stick to how this looks for me on my campus. We are going to be looking at two things, proactive measures and responsive measures, because basically we're in a situation where I'm going to have to operationalize everything Nancy said in a way that is simplified, that creates a checklist for us as schools, and that at the end of the day it's going to show somehow that when we're dealing with cyberbullying that we have shown every ounce of due diligence, that nobody's going to accuse us of exhibiting deliberate indifference. The truth is kids don't have a choice whether they come to school, so we have an obligation to protect them when they do. And what we're going to do today is I want to caution everybody to stop thinking everything in terms of bullying and cyberbullying. Look at it through the lens of mistreatment of others, because most of us now are in states where we are expected to report incidences of bullying and cyberbullying. So if every incident you report you take in is entitled bullying incident or bullying complaint, then that by default suggests that you've already decided that's what it is. So I want us to look at this not from an emotionally driven response, but just a simple, practical, what can we do with the resources we have? And so here we go. I think, based on what Nancy said, that I understand at least a piece of what the law says about what we can and cannot do. So I've tried to simplify it. Clearly, as an educator, if I can't remember it on the fingers of one hand, I'm not going to remember it at all. So what we're looking at today is the 5 R's of the situation we're currently in, because the truth is it's already happening. It's in our schools. It's in that hallway outside my office right now. So we have to know how to respond to it immediately. First thing we've got to recognize is there's this massive wisdom-knowledge gap. We have all of the wisdom. The kids have all of the technological know-how, and what we're going to have to do is manage that gap somewhere in between, because our students do not have the capacity to really filter or process in a way that's productive. And so here we go. Here's my 5 R's. First thing I'm going to say is always, always, always respond. Respond to any mistreatment that is reported to us as educators. You and I both know that the first thing that happens is the media gets hold of stories and the claim is, oh, we reported it to the school and they just didn't do anything with it, or we never heard back. So always validate anybody who reports to you or anybody who reports an incident about something on campus. And at the risk of doing now a word from our sponsors, I will say I do use ANCOM on my campus. I even though I believe firmly that programs don't change behavior, people do, I will tell you the Let's Talk About It has been one of the most valuable tools I have. So after that commercial break, moving on, one of the things I will say about responding to students is ask the student, what do you need from me? Ask them. We tend to go off with half the information and do these massive investigations, and it's like Nancy said, the kids look around afterwards and go, I don't know why I told them about this because it's just made it worse. So just ask a student, what do you need from me to do next? Here are my next steps. How do you feel about that? There can be no surprises when you respond. When you get on to researching allegations, make sure that you just take in the facts. Get the obvious things, the names, places, witnesses, to whom things were reported. Ensure that your staff understand that you want exact language used. We're all grown adults here. There's no point somebody sending you a referral that says a student used inappropriate language. That doesn't mean anything. I can't call a parent and say a student used inappropriate language because the question is, what did they say? So use exact language. Obviously, like Nancy said, protect any information that you have, screenshots and so forth, because you're going to need that documentation later. It is true that most of us now are in states where we will be required to report. So any evidence you can maintain will be awesome. The other piece of this, just on the human side, is find out what the elephant is in the room, because the truth is these incidences rarely happen in isolation. Find out what the antecedents were and what happened afterwards. Were there precipitating factors? Did this mama call the other mama and now the mama's involved? If you don't ask, you're not going to know. So make sure that you have all of the information before you move forward, because a little bit like Nancy implied, the certainty of consequences with students and that knowing has far more impact than the severity of those consequences. And so what we're going to do now is get on to the point where, okay, if I have to record, what am I going to record? And the truth is that we get wrapped into this whole bullying, cyberbullying piece. Don't do that. Like I said earlier on, make it about mistreatment of others. And that way, when you get to the end of your investigation, you get to analyze, was it bullying? Was it harassment? Was it just pure meanness? You don't know until you have all of the information. So make sure that you get all of that before you move forward with any reaction to it. Always keep a folder with all of those in so that once you have ascertained whether it's bullying or cyberbullying or not, you know to whom it needs to be reported. Because at some point, if it's a violation of Office of Civil Rights issues, or if it's harassment, or if it's bullying, you may have to report to a Title IX coordinator, or you may have to report to somebody in your district. So you're going to have to keep all of that information. I would say another cautionary measure when you're doing this is don't make the mistake of reading everything that comes through your email. I think we've all been bombarded by definitions, by case law, by legislation, by constitutional law, by people trying to sell you something. Don't get wrapped up in that. Go back to your code of conduct. Only use definitions that are in your code of conduct. Ask yourself simple questions, as Nancy implied. Is it on or off campus? Is there a nexus between the incident that's been reported and your school, especially if we're talking about summer break? Is it interfering with the educational process? But more importantly, does it violate your code of conduct? And if you look, you'll be surprised. I pulled up a couple of code of conducts this afternoon, and there were at least 11 locations in a regular code of conduct where cyberbullying incidences could be deemed to be a violation. Everything from district authority and jurisdiction. Most codes say something to the effect of whenever the interests of the districts are involved. School-related conduct regardless of time and location. So there are all these areas, acceptable user policy, obviously, safety transgressions, mistreatment of others. All of those things are in your code of conduct. Stick with that. Don't go outside. Don't go getting definitions from anywhere else. So then let's assume you have made your reports. here is the piece that I would consider my Achilles heel, is not going back and revisiting the situation in a timely manner. Let a week, a couple of weeks pass, and then go, how's it going for you? Call the victim in. Call anybody who reported in. Call a parent and go, hey, I'm just following up. How's the situation? Have things improved? Because you do not want anybody to come back later and say, well, she'd said she'd fixed it, but actually it got worse and nobody followed up with me. So those are your 5 R's. And now let's assume that summer has arrived and you are getting ready for next year. So now you get to operationalize some of the things Nancy talked about. Again, don't forget, programs don't change behavior, people do. So here's the first thing I will say, without a doubt, get the right people on the bus. No good if the adults in your building are bullies. If you have a custodian that scares people to death, a nurse that you wouldn't go to if you were bleeding from a jugular vein, those people need to be gone. So get the right people on your campus. And the truth is, if we want to spend time doing what we came into this business for, which is not handling cyberbullying, we need to have systems in place to handle them when they do. If you get, as we all do this time of year, an email that says, hey, it's time to update our code of conduct and our handbook, be proactive in that. Review those policies. Be a part of creating solutions to this rather than sit back and wait for it to slap you in the face. And make sure that anything you produce as a campus, I've made this mistake, where you put out a plan or a calendar and you put a synopsis of policies in the front, make sure they still align with the definitions of your code of conduct. Because if they don't, that's a hill you will die on. Making your professional development meaningful, talking to your staff about here are the non-negotiables. If the truth is you won't tolerate somebody calling somebody else gay on your campus, then you need to tell your teachers, my expectation is that you respond immediately. They need to know that's your non-negotiable. They can't read our minds. So your professional development needs to be comprehensive and cohesive, and everybody has to be involved in that process, or it's not going to be meaningful. The truth is the kids on our campus are going to take their emotional cues from the top, and that's us, or the custodian, or the cafeteria worker. And so if they see each other treating each other respectfully and responding appropriately, then that is the behavior that they will mirror. And that may sound obvious, but if you think about it, we all have someone on our campuses or have had somebody that probably doesn't model our expectations for this kind of behavior. The piece about personal responsibility, again, for the adults, but more importantly, and Nancy addressed this some, the notion of our students actively participating in being a part of the solution and not always a part of the problem. I hate the term bystander. I think we should get rid of it because I don't believe there is such a thing as a guiltless role. You really are either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And so I would encourage you not to allow a situation where your kids talk about being bystanders. Somebody knew that that violence was going to happen, and if kids don't report, then you can't do anything to fix it. Again, anonymous reporting is the way it goes. My kids will text me all the time, and I think it engages them in protecting and creating their own climate. If you and I, as campus people, don't create the climate, then the students are going to do it for us. And so we need to have them engaged in the conversation so that they actively help us with that. And the last piece of this is really that public piece. Everybody's asking us, what do you do on your campus to protect students from cyberbullying? Well, whatever you're doing, you better tell everybody. You better visit with parents. We need to have parent nights. And you know what? The truth is you and I both know that the people who come to parent nights are not the ones that need to be there. But that's okay. If you only get 5 people come, that's 5 more people in your community that understood the nature of cyberbullying and what it does in our schools. And then the other piece of that is the perception piece. If you report to the media all the good things you're doing, then if and when something goes wrong, they already know. They know what you have done proactively as a school to contain the cyberbullying. And that's good enough. It's the best that you can do because you're really trying to just show due diligence versus deliberate indifference. And so you have 5 proactive things. You have 5 responsive things. I've only used 10 fingers and taken up my time. I have a website that you're welcome to go to for any slides, any handouts. I have this put up together as a checklist, which is an easy, okay, did I do this? Did I do this? What do I need to do next? So I will make sure that's posted by the end of the day. And if you have any questions, I'm available.
BJ, thank you so much. I think that was some great and helpful information. I think your presentation and Nancy's presentation really complemented each other. So I want to get right to questions. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Nancy, let me start with you. We have a question that asks, is there a place where administrators can go to see samples of guidelines and procedures for addressing cyberbullying? I'm guessing you have some resources, and there may be some resources elsewhere.
There are resources on my site, the embracingdigitalyouth.org. I also really like the work of Samir Hinduja and Justin Patchen at the Cyberbullying Research Center, and I strongly recommend their site. Elizabeth Englander, who's up in Massachusetts Aggression Reduction Center, also is doing some really stellar work in this area.
Great. So at those places, people can find samples that they can build on for their own schools and their own districts?
Yes.
Great. BJ, let me ask you, I think this is an interesting question. What kind of support do you get from your parents, from your students' parents, when you are addressing issues of cyberbullying that take place off campus? Are parents supportive when you need to either respond or put disciplinary measures in place, or is this a sort of a tough situation?
Yes and yes. There's 2 answers to that. Most situations, if we simply pick up a phone and call a parent and say, hey, you anywhere near a computer, log in here, let me show you something that your son or daughter are involved in. Most parents will say, oh my gosh, thank you for letting me know, I will take care of it. And that's the truth. I mean, the whole thing's been dramatized hugely in recent media issues, but the truth is, in most cases, parents are responsive, especially if they know that you're engaging them in that process and not gone straight to the punitive end of things. So on that level, yes. But the flip side of that, I'm going to have to say, most principals know this, or educators know this, you really have to operate from a place of courage, conscience, and conviction. You're going to have to make decisions because you should, not because the law has made its mind up, because it's not going to make its mind up in time for us, and the conviction that somebody's going to challenge you, and they're not going to be happy. And you know what? Sometimes that's okay. That's okay. If you've made those decisions in the best interest of students, it's okay if they're unhappy.
I think that's great advice.
Can I jump in on that also?
Jump in. Yes.
I think if we can switch our mindset from your child has done this, we're going to punish your child and let your kids stay at home and play video games for the next 3 days, that's when I think the situation causes parents to rebel. But if you approach it from the perspective, just as Barbara was saying, is hey, well, first of all, you got this great evidence, so it's no longer, well, my child wouldn't do that. You've got the evidence in that. But it's really reaching out to say, hey, you know, your child is engaging in hurtful behavior. What's going on in your child's life? What's happening here? Because we want your child to also feel safe and secure and be successful at school. So if you're on the same side as the parent, that everybody is working to help this young person succeed, then I think you can get that level of cooperation. By the way, I also wanted to say I totally agree with BJ that we need to get rid of the word bystander. It implies standing by. That's why I'm using the word helpful ally, and I'm not sure what BJ is using, but that's really important.
That's great.
I'm using hey you. That's what I'm
saying. Hey you.
Hey you. Tell him to knock it off. That's my clinical term.
BJ, let me ask you, and Nancy, you can chime in on this too. We have a question about whether bullying over video chats like Skype is considered cyberbullying, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what is cyberbullying. I mean, what are some of the characteristics of it? Is it just something like Facebook? What are some of the things that parents might not know about that crop up for students in terms of cyberbullying?
Well, Nancy is better at the technical end of this, so I'll let her do that piece. But I will just frame it with this in mind. Again, don't define it using the C word or the B word. Think of it in terms of mistreating one another. Maybe just what they're doing is plain unkind, and you should operate from that position. But Nancy, you educate us on the platform.
I absolutely agree. I think that the terms bullying and cyberbullying have been overused. I'm actually trying to get away from it, using terms like hurtful behavior, aggressive. I like mistreating. Essentially, it's being hurtful to somebody using some form of digital technology. The most common from some of the surveying I've been doing, the most common forms are using cell phone texting, posting on social networking sites, and that's Facebook, Twitter, or sending private messages, and usually that's also on Facebook. So it's just being hurtful using digital technologies. The challenge we have, and I was really interested in hearing how BJ was talking about the different reporting, and I actually dislike the statutes that are requiring this kind of reporting, is that we have this whole range of kind of situations where young people are being hurtful, and maybe they were hurt before, and you know what started this, and it's that kind of traditional idea that we have this big bully thug and this helpless little wimp isn't really a lot of what we're seeing. Sometimes we see that in schools, but a lot of times this is hurtful conflict.
Got it. BJ, let me ask you this. What should a parent or even a staff member do in a school that doesn't really address this issue and doesn't have a policy on cyberbullying? How do you suggest, to start having this type of conversation, whether it's from a parent perspective or from a staff member perspective?
Well, that sort of comes down to you can deal with it now or you can deal with it later. If you don't have a policy, when you least have the time and resources to do anything with it, it's going to bite you. So I think as a staff member or as a community member, you have to begin the conversation. And I think the hardest conversation for us as practitioners is we think we have to have the answer to everything all the time. And we are in reaction mode. We're going to deal with this. We're going to fix this. And I think we have to step back and look at the situation in a less reactive, emotional way. And I think just having that conversation with teachers and going, I really don't know. Or talking to a parent and going, I don't have an answer to this, but let's talk about what we can do. What does this look like Monday morning? That's everything I come back to. When we finish this conversation, we'll walk back in the hallway and we'll have parents on the phone. Let's have that conversation. Let's be open. Let's be honest. And let's admit we don't have all the answers.
So that's okay to do, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
In the surveying that I'm doing, I'm finding that there are a lot of young people who are the recipients of hurtful behavior online. A whole heck of a lot of them are competently handling these situations, but some of them are not. But I'm getting ratings of reporting to a school around 20% of those who were targeted are actually reporting to a school. So a heck of a lot of this is going on that's under the surface, and it really, really is interfering with the ability of your kids to succeed. I mean, if you're going to measure yourself based on test scores, hate that. But if you're going to measure that, it is interfering with the ability of your students to be happy and successful. The other thing I saw, and I do not know if this data is valid, but even if it's half close, this was a report on gang activity in Chicago, and the author of the report indicated that 2/3 of the violent incidents at school were generated prior to school on social media. So this is clearly affecting school. You might be trying to ignore it, but it's going on, and it's something that schools have to deal with.
Well, let me follow up on that a little bit. How, with the emphasis on test scores that you mentioned, Nancy, how can you get schools in general, this question's about private schools, but how can you get schools in general to make this type of anti-bullying initiative a priority when there's so many other things that a school really has to deal with?
Oh, I want to take that one. Can I take that one? Okay.
Jump on it, BJ.
Oh, I can't wait for this one. Okay. The irony of that is it's not really an option. Think about it. If a child doesn't feel safe coming to school, then they're not going to come. So it's one of those, really, it's not as if you can choose to address this or not address it. You have to address it. You want your kids to come to school and you want them to be safe. It's our obligation. That's the ethical thing we do first and foremost, is create a safe learning environment. And Nancy's right. If these things are happening, it's absolutely interfering with that child's ability to learn. And so I think that is just an ethical obligation that we have. What's changed is how we operationalize that belief system. And the other piece of that plays into what Nancy was saying, here's the bit that's frightening for practitioners, is good kids do terrible things in cyberspace. It's not, you can look at a group of kids and go, okay, that kid has a history of being in trouble. Good kids get sucked into this vortex and do terrible things. And so you also have a system in place where there's a get-out-of-jail-free card, that there is a way to say, I know you responded inappropriately, I get that, but tell me the rest of the story.
Nancy, let me ask you, what are the differences? I think this is an interesting question. Are there differences between genders when it comes to cyberbullying, both in how it takes place and in how educators should respond?
There appear to be, some of the research out there is showing differences in genders, and other research doesn't. But there's a tendency, I think, that girls tend to be targeted more. That is, they're targeted by other girls, and they're also targeted by boys. And a lot of these situations, especially at the high school level, are also related to the interpersonal relationship. He's mine, you can't talk to him, we just broke up, those kinds of things. So we've got a lot of relationship breakup issues here going on. But the research is not entirely consistent, but quite frankly, boys traditionally sort of solve issues physically, and girls have always been the ones who have been sort of really into these nasty communications, and that seems to be what's going on.
Got it. Let me ask either one of you, maybe BJ, this is a good question for you. What's the difference between responding and disciplining in a cyberbullying situation, and does some type of situation call for one and not the other?
It does, and that's part of the professional development piece is teachers and schools are very fearful right now because a lot of state laws have changed and they now require all of these things that teachers were doing inherently anyway, but now they're in panic mode about, well, do I have to write a kid up every time he does something inappropriate in my classroom and I hear it? So part of the professional development is helping staff understand you absolutely respond every time without fail. It doesn't require that you always report in a formal way. Now, if I tell a student in my classroom that's not an inappropriate way to behave, not appropriate. You know, you can't call somebody gay. That's not acceptable in our climate. And then they repeat that action. Then it becomes noncompliance. That's a simple, analytical, I gave you an instruction, you did not comply, now I'm going to follow through with the consequence. It's clear cut, there's no surprises, the students knew what the expectations were, and here is the outcome. And the other cautionary thing with all of this panic button mode is that what I hear when principals call me or assistant principals is a little bit of overreaction. They're overreaching because they're trying to send this clear message to their community that it's not tolerated. And I have to do the step back for a second. Is that in alignment with your code of conduct? Is that outcome appropriate for the action, or are you just using the child to send a message because that will have an adverse effect? Because like Nancy says, it's more about a restorative situation. You're trying to change their behavior, not make a point.
Nancy, let me ask you. You know, and one of you touched on this a little bit during your presentation, Nancy. I think it was you. But what should be done if a faculty member is a victim of threats or hateful comments? We've been talking a lot about cyberbullying between students, but I know that a lot of what goes on online is negative comments and negative things directed at staff members.
Yeah, this is a really challenging situation, and I did have a slide on that. But I've paid attention to a variety of reports and things, and the problem is that sometimes we have staff in our schools who are not as kind and respectful as they should be. And BJ even touched on this a little bit. Unfortunately, a tendency that I see quite frequently is to always blame the student and not to do a full investigation of what's going on. An experience, I have a daughter who's now a senior. When she was in 7th grade, she was in a classroom with a teacher who needed to retire. And this teacher was being abusive, and particularly was being abusive of a particular student. And the other students in the class were actually trying to capture evidence of this on a cell phone. It's like, the other thing is that when a student is lashing out like that, something is going on in their life that simply isn't working. And unless we figure out what it is, we're not going to resolve the situation. So most schools have sort of a formal threat assessment kind of a process that really does delve into what's going on psychosocially with the students, the situation, et cetera. And I think that we need to do an adaptation of that threat assessment protocol in situations where students have targeted teachers. It may be just a kid who had a really bad day, and the kid will immediately show remorse and apologize, and we can move on. But this may be a student who's really at high risk of failure, and there may be a situation. I mean, there was a recent videotape that a special ed student took of his teacher who was really, really denigrating him. So we've got to do a full investigation, looking at the whole situation. Also, because of the state of the case law, if a teacher has been attacked or a staff member's been attacked, it's really difficult to legally justify a disciplinary consequence on that student. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. If we can shift it into an effective investigation and then a restoration kind of an intervention, then we're addressing the issue and trying to make sure that that student remains in school, can become back part of the school community, and be a success.
I think that's a great way of looking at it.
The other piece of that, just to piggyback off that, the other piece of that too is that I would tell educators, let it go. You're the adult. This too shall pass. It's a lot like colored contact lenses and feathers in your hair. if you don't react to it eventually, in most cases, the kids will naturally get tired of it and move on.
Great.
Isn't that what we also sometimes recommend to students?
Yeah.
There's a difference. We're the adults, you know. We have that knowledge-wisdom gap. They are in the gap. We're supposed to have the wisdom. So.
Yes.
BJ, we have one more quick question before we have to wrap up the question part of this. At what point do you involve the authorities, I guess meaning police or somebody sort of above the school level?
You know, it's a great question. The interesting thing is that education law and penal code kind of run parallel paths, and then sometimes they intercept and sometimes they go off at a tangent. But I would revert to Nancy's point there. You've got the criminal proceedings and you've got civil proceedings. If it's a threat and it meets the elements of threat, in other words, you've looked at what was the reaction of the person that received it, was the threat conditional, you know, if you don't do this, I'm going to whoop you. Was the threat made directly? What's the history of the people involved? Those kinds of things. The reasonable person test. If it meets those parameters, then sure, you've nothing to lose by engaging law enforcement. And students and parents always have a right to proceed with things civilly if they, through civil courts, if they feel that their rights have been violated as human beings. But I would only involve law enforcement to the extent that I honestly believe is going to interfere with the educational process. And that's my mantra, and I stick to it.
Great. Well, we'll have to end the question and answers there, but I want to give a big thanks to both of you. Before we wrap up, I'd like to take another minute to hear from our sponsor, Talk About It Anonymous Communication Service.
Thank you. This has really been an important and timely event, and the information that was shared by our speakers I know is incredibly valuable for all of us. In thinking about what schools can do to give students a voice and make them a part of the solution to solving problems like cyberbullying, I actually created the Talk About It service back in 2005, and it creates a way for students to speak up through the text and online messaging and get help for issues affecting them. So the interesting thing is really the types of issues that we see our students grappling with, which are quite broad in scope. We see everything coming through this beyond just traditional issues, even things like stress. Many students are reaching out for help because of it, and other issues such as cutting and self-injury. Perhaps not surprisingly to anyone is that middle schoolers are speaking up the most through the Talk About It service, and although we see others, even as low as third and fourth graders, beginning to use the service as well. And all of this is really due to where we are seeing students living these days, online and via text messaging. Even if schools have policies against cell phone use on campus, students are finding a way to communicate. And by embracing these channels and using them to meet students where they are, we're able to have these teachable moments about how best to communicate. We've just posted Creating a Culture of Dialogue, which is a comprehensive new paper outlining practical steps for creating an environment in which our students will feel comfortable speaking up. The paper includes funding resources, too, and the talk.schoolmessenger.com site includes this and many more resources that will hope you'll take a moment to check out. All of these, of course, are free. A little bit more about our service. For far too long, we've told students to speak up and not be these passive bystanders, but both statistically and anecdotally, we know this is not happening. Our students, of course, do know the most about what's happening in school, and ultimately they will shape the school's climate. So by giving them a voice, we can actually empower them to take responsibility for the climate and the culture of their school. Too often, a loud minority silences the majority, and by opening a door, a virtual door, we found students will willingly walk through to introduce issues, and as a result, we've documented two surprising findings. One, students often don't prefer to send messages anonymously. Almost 2-to-1 messages are sent non-anonymously because students aren't concerned with being anonymous from their coach or their teacher or their counselor as much as they are their peers for fear of committing social suicide. Secondly, schools consistently report increases in direct face-to-face communication between students and staff members due to the teachable moments each message presents. The counselor being able to arrange to meet with a student before school or after school or at a time and place that is least embarrassing for the student. So once again, I just want to thank everyone and our speakers especially for sharing their expertise. We're really pleased to have been able to be a part of this event, and please remember to visit talk.schoolmessenger.com to grab our white paper. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. I want to let all of you know out there that Education Week and Education Week Digital Directions has written several in-depth stories on the topic of cyberbullying. So if you want to learn even more about this issue, please check out the stories, and links are provided on your screen. Also, we'd like to remind you that if you'd like to watch today's presentation again, an on-demand archive will be made available through edweek.org within the next 24 hours. You can also visit edweek.org again to find the articles that address this topic as well. I want to say thank you very much again to our two guests, Nancy and BJ, and thanks to all of you for submitting so many great questions and making this a wonderful discussion. Thank you. Goodbye.